Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Sales Syndicate podcast, take 2. You guys won't see this on the podcast, but we've actually done the first 15 minutes of this already, and we're going over again because we had some initial technical difficulties. So fortunately, we've got some time in with Mr. Tom Sutton, who's joined me here today. Tom, for those who maybe don't know who you are able to give us a bit of an introduction, give us a little bit of background about who you are and, why we're talking today?
Sure. For the second time.
Yeah, hopefully not the third.
Hi, folks. Ellis, thanks for having me on this. I appreciate it. I'm quite excited to be here. My name's Thomas Sutton. I work for a company called NCC Group. We're a cybersecurity and software resilience business based in the UK, but pretty much servicing most of the global market, at least in the developed world. I'm an account director. I spent the first part of my career in the UK. I'm from the north of England, so I lived in Manchester, and I emigrated to the US about 5 years ago, and I now live in Atlanta, Georgia. But in my time, I don't profess to be some sort of sage or, expert on international selling, but I have sold to a lot of countries by either being there or selling to them from different geographies. So hopefully I can share some experiences and things that I've learned along my career that people will find useful on this podcast.
We're excited to have you on, mate. Just for those who have just joined us, so I've actually been on a few episodes of the Sales Syndicate podcast before, but if for whatever reason you've missed episode 1 through 5 and decided to skip ahead to this episode, which I'm sure is going to be the best one yet, I'm Ellis Campbell. I'm the head of enterprise here at Selligence. So again, I've got background selling into different international territories, having sold into EMEA, into APAC, Middle East, the US. So between the two of us, hopefully we'll find a few nuggets of knowledge and information to share with everyone. Me and Tom have crossed paths initially back in our NCC Group days. Probably worth noting, Tom, as well, all of these opinions here today are neither mine from a Selligence standpoint. These are all my personal opinions, and I'm sure Tom wants the same caveat. None of
this time.
You did, but it's okay. I've got you covered. So none of these opinions. These are our personal opinions and not of the companies we represent. So now that we've got those caveats out the way, maybe let's jump into it. So international selling. What's your experience? So you mentioned they're really top level, but just to give a bit of an idea, what sort of territories have you sold into?
So I think firstly, international selling is a very broad topic. You could spend a long time talking about this, researching this, studying this. So obviously we're not going to cover everything on a podcast like this. So my experience, when I was based in the UK, I was obviously focused on the UK market and some of mainland Europe and a little bit US, but it was more challenging being based in the UK. Obviously now I've moved to America. I've been servicing the North American market, so US, all over the US. Obviously, the US is so huge. It's there's so many different cultures just in the US alone, and Canada.
Yeah.
But also, weirdly, since I moved to America, I've done a few deals with customers that are in India, in Singapore, a few different parts of Asia Pac, and China. So I've got a bit of experience selling internationally into those sort of countries as well, which we can talk on in a minute. But yeah, very broad topic, and like I say, I'm not some sort of oracle on this, but I have some experience. But yeah, that's a bit of a snippet.
Yeah, I think if someone's come on here to find an oracle that can tell them everything about international selling, they may have come to the wrong podcast. But if they want to come to two guys who have sold into a lot of different countries and can share some useful information, then I think they're in the right place. And you're right, you've hit the nail on the head. Unless someone wants to sit here and listen to me and you talk for 4 or 5 hours, which I'm sure no one wants to do that.
Yeah,
we could. Yeah, I mean, if there was a few pints there as well, then definitely it could go on and on and on. But no, I think we'll go very broad level, top level today when we talk about international selling. And if we find that there's another episode to come, maybe focusing on a particular vertical or area or geography, then we can always explore that further down the line. I think maybe the first thing for us just to maybe touch upon and look at, which quite broad. But how have you found like different cultures when you're going into international selling? So US obviously being a big one for you, being based out there, but even just further afield from maybe some of your earlier days, how have you seen that? Is there a massive difference? What's your experience?
I think that when you're looking at different markets, there's two ways to look at it. So the first is looking at like the formal things about the country, like its history, its legal system. Like, was it part of the Commonwealth? Is it part? How it kind of functions as a formal country.
Yeah.
So like things that you got to think about, like barriers to entry from a legal perspective. And China and India are good examples of that. Israel is another one. And then when you think about culture, there's massive differences between different countries. And obviously you'll never fully understand the culture of a different country that you're trying to work with, but you should at least try or have a high level understanding, and that'll really help you. There's something that is quite interesting that I'd actually recommend people have a look at after the podcast if they want to. There's something called Hofstede's cultural dimensions, which is a way that you can see how this researcher from like decades ago has basically come up with measurements of how to kind of at a top level assess different cultural dynamics of different countries. Things like power distance, things like uncertainty avoidance. There's lots of different things that you can actually look at that'll give you something to actually like a measurement. So that's something to think about and look at if you're interested after this podcast. It's called Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions. And so that when you look at that, there's loads of differences. Like countries like Singapore and Asia Pac, they're very, very detail focused. They're thinking about not leaving anything unturned, thinking about every circumstance. So they're very certain to avoid uncertainty. And there are other cultures that are different to that. You agree the principles, what you're going to do, and then you go ahead and you trust each other to get it done. So there's loads of differences. And one thing that I found that and this is a small thing, but when I moved to America, my first business trip to America, I went to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And I was working in Manchester, like, we had quite a corporate culture. You'd wear a suit to the office, as was quite common in the UK, probably still is a little bit. And so I went to San Francisco thinking, right, I'm just going to wear business casual. I'll wear chinos, some brown shoes and a shirt. And everyone was like, why are you dressed up so formally? Like, what are you doing? And I was like, I thought I was dressed casually, but everyone's just hanging out with jeans and a T-shirt, working for these big tech companies, just a completely different attitude to kind of attire for work. And it's the same in Atlanta, same in Georgia. Much less formal, much more casual, so to speak. Doesn't change how hard people work. It's just something that was a bit of a culture shock to me when I came to America that I didn't think would be one.
No, and is that, you've obviously been out there for a little while now. Was that the same like pre-pandemic and post-pandemic? Because I mean, at least from British side of things, it's definitely been a shift from wearing a suit and tie and a full-blown suit into the office to then today I'm wearing a polo shirt onto the office, and again that's probably classed as quite smart compared to some people in the office. So is that been the same all the way through, or has it got even more casual since you've come into a pandemic? If it can.
So we're still in a hybrid model. I think most businesses in North America are. So I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I don't think it's changed that much because the US kind of was already pretty casual as it is. But if you were to look at somewhere like Wall Street, I don't know if it's different. Maybe it is. Maybe it's just the UK catching up, Ellis. I don't know.
I would probably tend to agree because, I don't think I could go back to sitting at a desk, even at a day where you're just, making a few phone calls and you're doing admin and you've got to sit there with a full-blown shirt and tie on. It's just, it's not the one. And I don't know about you, but we've got table tennis in our office, and it's really hard to play table tennis in a pair of tight work trousers. So I'm very, very thankful for the relaxation of the clothing etiquette.
Can you take with suit pants?
No, and I'm not a small guy, so that's definitely not a strong point of mine. As you would have well known, having worked with me in the past, so I'm quite thankful for the relaxation of it. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at other cultures, you touched on a good few points there, I thought. So you've got the US in terms of culture of how you interact, and maybe you mentioned there the way that people do business slightly differently and power dynamics between it. How does that work with you being a Brit, do you tend to find that most of the time when you're dealing with these sorts of people, there's sort of an understanding that you're not an American and therefore they give you a little bit more leniency? Or do you find actually it's the opposite way around and, they want to test it to see if if you've acclimatized yourself to the US way of things?
I'm pretty acclimatized, Ellis, because my wife is American. Both
Yeah.
my kids are American, so I'm pretty acclimatized now. I'd say being a Brit can be used as an icebreaker because obviously it's something different. Yeah. But it really depends on the company you're dealing with, and it depends on, I guess, not just US, different countries too. So when you sell into, I've not experienced it much, but when you sell into India, there are some folks that just want to work with Indian organizations. I get it.
Yeah.
It's definitely the same in China because there are barriers to entry for organizations that don't trade in those countries to do business with Chinese or Indian organizations. And you don't think it, but it really is quite challenging first time around. But in the US and the businesses I work with, they're quite global organizations. They've got reasonably good global standards and global practices and global policies. So, you're dealing with people that are coming from all over the world anyway. So that really helps. But being a Brit, maybe it's an icebreaker. I don't know. You'll have to ask people that deal with me. But, yeah.
Well, fortunately, I've asked people that have dealt with you, and we're bringing them on today. So, no, I'm joking. I think the good thing, especially when we look at the US, I think it's quite good. Again, I'm a Brit that sells largely to the US. I'm not based out there, but I'll spend my evenings doing demos and even like new business development. I think the culture of even like cold calling or doing like business development outreach from the US, for me, it just tends to be a little bit more direct compared to what happens in the UK. So you'll deal with someone and, you warm them up and you'll talk about them and try to build the relationship. Whereas I think a lot of the time the Americans I deal with, it's just a little bit more blunt and to the point. And as a salesperson, I love that because I learn very quickly whether I'm wasting my time or whether I'm interested there. But I do think the Britishness does help to a degree. It might just buy you that 5 to 10 seconds more of intrigue from that initial outreach or that initial call to hear your pitch. And there is a mutual colleague we've both worked with in the past who I know massively leverages his British accent while working in the US. I'm assuming you know who that person is. I'm hoping that he's watching this as well because I'm sure he'll love getting the shout out. But I definitely know it can help just by having a different sort of voice or a different tone of voice of someone coming from a different angle.
I think it can. And, you've got to kind of use every tool that's at your disposal. But I think on the directness, that's definitely true. But it also depends on where you are in the US, like what part of America you're dealing with. Because if someone from New York will probably be a lot more direct with you than someone that is from a different part of the country. And I have actually been given that feedback that just get to the point. You know what I mean? Because we like to,
small talk.
I don't know how to say it, but you butter things up when you just get to the point, be a bit more direct. I do think that is true, but it is in different parts of the country. It's different for sure.
Yeah, and we won't cover all of that on an episode because I think if you was going to try and break it down state by state, we really would be here a long time. And that's probably the one area for me that's probably an area of improvement that we think we always need to work on is being based in the UK. It's so hard to gauge the differences between those states. I feel like most things, most countries and cultures, that you only can really learn that when you've lived out there and you've experienced it. And I mean, you with an American wife and living in the US and still, even to this day, learning the different nuances shows us that you're never really going to fully get it unless you're there. And I guess that's why when you look at, we touched upon countries like India and China and even Israel to a degree where, there's literally policies in place about trying to keep stuff in country, in house in terms of the other businesses they work with. It's not a surprise when you look at any sales organizations that when they typically tend to target, even in Europe, Germany or France, most businesses will try to get a native speaker, someone who's been out there, worked the market, because it is so hard to go to these countries to try and open up, not just even existing account management business where you've got that relationship, but even like new business. I feel like unless you've got someone there to champion you in the first place, it becomes quite a hard sell.
Yeah. I mean, the cultural differences between UK and US, still finding them today. And I've been married to my wife for 8 years and I've lived in the US for 5 years. That is definitely true. And one thing that I used to find was when I get a really direct response, like years ago from someone, I'd think it was rude, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
It's just someone just being direct with you. So it's not rude. It's just, they're just being clear and direct. And some people totally prefer that. I would say that the markets you mentioned, so I've got experience dealing with India and China, but they were from referrals from global businesses that I work with that just had subsidiaries or had acquired businesses in those countries. And there were, for sure, barriers to entry to dealing with those countries. And I didn't take them seriously. I thought, we'll get through this. But it is difficult. Like with Indian organizations, you've got to provide them with loads of documentation, tax exemptions. There's tax implications on invoicing Indian companies. That's actually quite challenging. So going through that process at the first is difficult. And in China, I think it used to be you had to have your company or your subsid part owned by either a Chinese organization, or there had to be some sort of shared ownership with
connection there
to work. Otherwise, you couldn't do business there. And if you're trying to do business with China as an outside business, it has to be a pure play offshoring arrangement. Otherwise, you can't do the business. And so it's tough. They're tough markets. And I don't hunt there. I'm not going to say I do. I don't. And that's not my job. I'm focused on predominantly North American markets. But it's interesting. And it's a very broad topic, like you say.
I guess, and we sort of semi-covered this on our take one of our podcasts, but I think you mentioned to me before that once you've gone through that process once, it becomes a lot easier though, because once you've gone through there, you learn, right, what certifications do I need? What do I need in order to win business here? And this goes for international selling, but this goes for going into new verticals, new areas, whether you're moving into enterprise selling or whatever it may be. It's always a case of once you've learned, what do I need in place to be able to do business with these organizations? Once you've got that first successful use case, it becomes so much easier to replicate that success because you know now what they're looking for, which then makes you seem more confident. That gives them more confidence in your business. And then you can obviously look to replicate that success.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's twofold because you know what you're walking into and whether to do the business in the first place. Like if you think this is, when you know the hurdles you've got to jump through, the paperwork you've got to provide, the approvals you've got to give, you look at the dollar value of the deal and you decide, am I going to do this or not? That's going to help in your own decision making. But then if it is a deal you want to pursue, being able to explain to a customer that you know the process or you've been through it before, you've got experience with it, it gives them confidence to buy from you. Otherwise, they might have some serious trepidation. And when I've done business with organizations from those companies, that's one of the things you get asked straight away. Have you done business with companies from this country before? And if you have, and you can explain that, and they get confidence that you understand the process, then you've got more likelihood of making a sale. So I think it's twofold in the value that gives. Once you've gone through it once, which is challenging, and you've got to make that call as a business or as a salesperson. Do you want to do that? Is this a good market for us or not? And that's, I guess, part of the early decision-making process as to whether you want to try that or not.
Yeah, and I think, well, you've hit a good point there again, I think, which is you weigh it up, don't you? Like if you sell into one of these countries and it's a small deal and you go, well, actually, it's probably costing us more to do this business. But then at least as a business, when you understand that, you can decide, well, is this opportunity large enough that it's worth us going through that process again because the output and the results are going to be there? Or actually, as you said, do we go, actually, this isn't worth our time. This is going to cause more issues. The time we spent on this opportunity, we could have been focusing on another opportunity and making more of that money back. So I think that's probably a really big point, is weighing up where you're likely to have success, where the path of least resistance sometimes, and then understanding how you can maximize that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Do your research. Be honest with yourself. Don't think you know everything, and then you'll ultimately make a better decision as to whether to pursue it or not.
Nice. Moving in that same direction, just making sure we're staying on track. We know we've got a lot to cram into this episode, Tom. Maybe looking at, we've talked a lot about different territories. How did you find, maybe this is a good point to look back from when you were in the UK. How did you find the terms of the US working hours different? You mentioned you work in APAC, you work in the UK and the US. Did you have a process to that? How did you find that? Or did you find people were quite flexible because they knew you were in a different geography?
It's before the pandemic, and we started really, because I used to work in the office when I first moved to America. I did a sort of 8 till 5. And I went and did a full day in the office yesterday. I was exhausted. I was like, no, I can't do it.
I can't do it either anymore. It feels so weird if you spend 5 days in a row in the office now.
Yeah, it just exhausts you. But before it was pretty similar. Now, obviously, you've got different time zones in the US because you've got the West Coast, which is 3 hours difference to the East Coast, which is quite a lot. So you end up probably having to work a little bit varied hours when you work in the office. But since we've moved to remote working, it's just totally changed how I work. So I deal with some global banks, and they've got presences in Asia Pac. So you'll end up doing work with folks in Asia Pac, like Singapore and India, and that means you have to work random hours. Like I'll do random calls at early in the morning. That many years ago I just wouldn't have even thought about it. I'm not at 5 a.m, but now it's like you just do it, and then you take an hour off in the middle of the day. You just have a break, you have a long lunch or something like that. Your hours are just totally different. I think in the job that I do, and I hope my boss isn't listening to this, but the days of having a 9 to 5, they're gone.
No, I agree. The thing is, though, they're getting more out of you. I don't know anyone that works multiple geographies. I don't know a single person who, when you look at their hours they're working less. There's not a single person, If someone, especially as salespeople, if we've worked a normal day, we've gone through it, and as you mentioned, someone in APAC says to you, "Yeah, Tom, I'm really interested. I've got this big opportunity. I want to try and do it this month." You can guarantee you're going to be doing that. And even if they went to you, "Right, I've got 3 of these back to back, 5:30 to 7, and I still need to do a full day." That's the needs of the business. When there's money on the line, there's targets to hit. We'll all be willing to be flexible, because we're all greedy salespeople and we all want money. So it's in our nature.
It really is. I do it, and then just take Friday afternoon off, right, Ellis?
I don't know what you're talking about, Tom. No, I don't think I've ever been in a pub at 4:00 on a Friday. Never. So. No, it's a good point, and I think that's the biggest thing is when people start looking at different. I feel like if you're going to look at international selling, and maybe this is more towards someone of slightly smaller organisations where they started off, whether it be the US or the UK initially, and maybe they're looking at venturing further afield. I feel like if you're going to do it, you just need to really fully commit. You can't have you can't try to micromanage both. You can't do the UK market and think, well, on the side hustle I'll start the US, because you just won't get into it. I feel like you need someone to be fully focusing their time and attention on it, and then you'll start seeing the real returns on that investment.
I totally agree. And ultimately, so one of my mates told me this quite recently, actually. He said, "He who pays says." So if the customer wants to do a call at 5 a.m. and you want to make the sale, then do it.
Yep.
That's a pretty clear rule to follow. But I'd say the cultural difference is, you've got to do it properly, like commit to it. Because like I've said before, you're not going to fully understand the culture, but you should try to and do your best to. And I remember when I moved to the US, being a Brit, I kind of assumed that I understood a lot about the culture, and it was very similar.
Yeah.
It's not at all. It's very, very different, and there's a lot to it that I'm still learning today, that I didn't appreciate whatsoever before I moved here. And I think that's a really important thing to note, that if you do want to really be successful in a different country, in a different culture, you've got to really immerse yourself in it and give it your best efforts. Otherwise, you'll likely not get the success you should.
No, completely valid advice for us to take away. The next point I was hoping to discuss with you, we've sort of touched upon it a bit already, but I call it almost like the legal section, which sounds like a really boring part of the podcast, but I think it's one that can be quite underestimated when you're looking at working with international businesses. So you mentioned already some of the issues around, we mentioned China, we mentioned Israel, we mentioned India. Maybe how do you manage that? I mean, imagine from a legal standpoint, a contractual standpoint, what law takes precedent when you're working with the US or the UK. How have you found the best way to manage that? Is that again customer led? Is that something you tend to provide guidance on?
Well, I'm quite fortunate in that I work for a reasonably global business, and we have attorneys in the US and in the UK and Europe, so we can kind of cover a lot of bases. But I would tend to take a customer-led approach within reason. And I'm not an expert on this. I'm not an attorney, or a lawyer, sorry. My apologies, Ellis.
That's okay, it's all right. I'm just secretly holding it against you, but it's okay.
Yeah, but I just follow the customer. Look, if it's a US customer, you're likely going to be asked to do US law, probably Delaware, because all companies tend to register themselves or do deals in Delaware law. There's reasons for it. Which I don't fully understand, but it's like privacy reasons or tax reasons. So I tend to just take a customer-led approach. But if you don't have expertise in the jurisdiction and you're not comfortable as a business writing a contract in that law, then obviously don't do it. You've got to weigh the risks up, which is another thing to think about before you decide to sell to a different territory. But I'm not an expert, Ellis, on this one.
No, I mean, I don't think, well, neither of us are legally trained, so definitely as another caveat, do not take legal advice from me and Tom. That's certainly not what we're recommending. But I think the issues I've seen, obviously given the nature of what I've done in the past and some of the work you've probably done as well, it's fine when you're working one business to one business, right? When I am working from the UK, contracting with someone in the US, our legal team sit down, their legal team sit down, we figure out, if ultimately the reality is if they're the paying client and they want US law, most of the time the supplier will accommodate that and will work with them because they want their money, want their business. I mean, when you can get into quite messy grounds is when you've got multiple, when you bring in, partners, when you bring in other third parties, when you bring in other companies into that mix. Maybe you're providing a service offering, but it works kind of hand in hand with another solution from another business. I think sometimes that can be underestimated as like how much of a stumbling block and an issue that can be, because if you end up working with providing your service offering from the UK to a US client with another third party who provide their software out of Israel, there's so much red tape and legality around that. It comes back to that point we mentioned earlier, that you really have to weigh up, are we all putting our time and effort into the right place? Is it actually worth us going through that, or is this going to be too difficult? Because I feel it's fine as long as one business can be flexible, but I feel like sometimes people can go out to look at targeting new markets and not really understand what they're letting themselves in for. And if you've invested 8 months into a full-blown enterprise sales cycle only to find out it's not going to be feasible. So I guess that the point I'm trying to make here in maybe a more long-winded way is I think it's good to try and vet out those issues, those legal issues, as early as possible. Don't be so afraid of losing the deal or losing the opportunity that you almost put off getting to that stage. It's better almost right at that early stage, at discovery call, that sort of first initial demo, whatever it may be for your product, service or offering, to just try and vet that out very early as possible. So that you're not wasting your time into a sales cycle that you're just never going to be able to close.
I totally agree. On an individual deal basis, absolutely. If you think there's going to be hurdles that are going to be real roadblocks, either deal with them up front, and if you can't deal with them, then the deal's not going to happen, is it? That's just a logical thing to do. And if you're thinking about getting into a new market, just do your research up front. Figure out, is this worth it for us? Is this a market we actually can win in? Like, who are the players? What are the cultural roadblocks? What are the formal roadblocks? If we can overcome them, great. If we can't, don't do it. That's just part of the decision-making process. I think that's something that salespeople, and I've definitely fallen into the trap. You chase deals for so long, you put so much energy into doing something that may happen, may not. But when you think about it, blooming heck, I've put 40 hours into that deal. It's hardly paid anything. Was it really worth it? And you have to be honest with yourself. Tough though.
That's it. No, it's right. And it's like, especially, I think the problem is we're all salespeople, right? If I'm targeting, and this is maybe less of the legal side, but if I'm targeting an opportunity with a client who works in another geography, I want my product to be such a fit for what they do that, I try to shoehorn it, or I try to make it fit because I can see the opportunity there. I've got a deal to close out to hit my forecast or my number. And I think we've mentioned this on other podcast episodes, but I think as salespeople, we have to ask the questions we don't always want to hear the answers to. And it's better to find that out. If you're going to lose, it's a cliche, but if you're going to lose early and lose quickly so you can move on and find those opportunities where you can win. On that same vein, so we mentioned obviously talking about legal contracts there. How do you manage sort of maybe probably more of like an MSA sort of style process? So where you're dealing with a client who they operate in APAC, they operate in the US, they operate in the Middle East. How do you manage that from like a global standpoint? Do you typically find, is it the UK headquartered office that takes that control? Is it tend to be, or maybe if there's other countries that are more difficult, do they typically try and take control of that because they've got more red tape? What's your experiences with that?
Obviously, the products and services that I work with, so it's very specific, my experiences to that.
Yeah.
And I would say follow the business that you're working with, take their steer. And what I mean by that is you've got a lot of businesses that are truly like global or multinational businesses that aren't particularly joined up deliberately. Like they may operate in different markets, in different geographies, and do different things. And so we'll have a deliberate decision. We are going to let our business units do what they need to do to be competitive in whatever it is they do. And so having global processes and global policies, I mean, they might, buy a Microsoft license globally or a HR system globally. But other than that, it's going to be relatively decentralized. So a lot of businesses deliberately do that. But there are some that try to have strict global policies, global procurement, global vendor management, and try to do things the same way in as best they can in all the territories and markets that they operate in. And so the way you structure an MSA will be very dependent on how a company works. Is a company global? Is a company global in kind of name, but not really in the way it operates? So doing an MSA with a company that's truly global, you do as much as you can, set standards, set process, repeatable. You go through all the approvals. You just make transacting as frictionless as you can moving forward. That's the goal. Make it easy for everybody to do business together. So everything you can put into an MSA that achieves that, go for it. If you can add value into it, go for it. If it's a different structure and it's different little business units making their own calls, then you just got to have to work on an individual basis and just figure out what's right for that line of business and how they want to work with you. And again, make the decision: is it worth going down the path, or are there other opportunities to try to create synergies? But I would always say, when I'm working on MSAs, I would just try to make them essentially you're making the downstream transacting as seamless and frictionless as you possibly can to make everybody's life easier and ultimately bring more revenue in for your organization and for yourself.
Yeah, I sort of asked you that question sort of in the answer, obviously looking to cover this off on the topic, because I do.
You know it. You say it yourself.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not the star of the show, Tom. You are today. So I think a lot of the time as well, I think with an MSA, I think sometimes in theory it sounds like really good practice, and for lots of businesses and the way they work, it's good. You can set a global standard. You can use that to leverage when you're dealing with other geographies. Maybe you haven't had the same normal day-to-day interaction. I think where people just have to be slightly careful and maybe caveat that slightly is that you will have businesses where, especially lots of companies where they built up through acquisition, whereas yes, they fall under like the umbrella of the overarching business and organizations, but you can sign what you think is a global MSA, but actually in reality, when you get into the detail, you haven't even, half of these businesses aren't aware that that's there, and it's not always fit for purpose, because to work with that location or that geography, you need different things. So I think the reason why I asked that question, to get your insight there, is because you're right. I think it's scoping that out and realizing that it's picking and choosing the right sort of way to approach it for each client. An MSA sounds great. You can go to your boss. We've got an agreement in place. Centrally, I'm tackling the whole opportunity, the whole account, all the geographies. But sometimes you can not shoot yourself in the foot, but if you can really get really tailored to each one of these, different locations, you might be able to get more, because you might be working on a more niche project. There might be bigger scope for work in that area that doesn't have to be loosely covered off by the MSA, where you can have more freedom to be able to go out there and maximize that opportunity. So I think that's just maybe something people should look at when they're considering both. And again, I caveat that I haven't done massive amounts of MSAs in my time. I'd love to say I've done it with every client, because that would mean I'm selling a lot, but I think it's just something for people to care of, depending on what your product, service, or offering is.
Yeah, I agree. You've got to just ultimately try to find the best way to transact easily and as from a sales side as margin rich as possible. But yeah, I echo what you're saying. One other thing to add to that, though, Ellis, is I have worked with some companies that need it. They need a signed agreement. They need a signed master, or they won't do business with you. And if that's the case, just get it done as quick as you can.
Yeah, well, you're not going to turn down their business, are you?
Yeah,
you're gonna sign it. Ultimately, if you need that to work with them, you're gonna do it. But I mean, it segues us quite nicely, really, onto to my next point, which is, so we're mentioning their different geographies and different offices. Forgetting the legal contractual side. I'm sure we've covered this again very top level, but for me, I think one thing I found really useful early on in my career is when I found success in one area, was trying to almost leverage those contacts and where we've had success to get introductions into other parts of the business. Sometimes that might be, I'm working with one sales team that sell one product and I'm trying to get in with another sales team. But a lot of the time it will be geography. So, I might be working with someone in the UK, but I know they've got a massive presence in the US. So how do you go about leveraging those relationships, and where do you find the most success when leveraging those relationships?
With customers, or like internally, or
probably customers? I'd probably say more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've been quite fortunate in that as I grown through my sales career, I've started to deal with more global customers, and they were kind of the ones that I had the success with, and they were able to set global policies and things like that. So it kind of happened it just happened organically. And a lot of the times when you're dealing with big, predominantly banking organizations who I work with, they've got global teams. Like, okay, you're supporting a line of business, but your team is global. You might have someone in, people in North America, people in Europe, people in India. So you're dealing with global teams, no matter where you are. So I'd say that's something that I've been quite fortunate in. But ultimately, for services where you can just repeat them in different countries and there aren't too many barriers, if you've made the decisions to do business in those countries, it's just the same old sales tactics. Do a good job, do the right thing, provide value, do what you say you're going to do, build those customer relationships to the point where they would voluntarily give you introductions. And it can also be something you can throw into any negotiation you do. Like if a customer's asking you for something, like they want some extra services or they want a discount or something, you should always say, yes, if you do this. And it's something I think about. If a customer wants a commercial incentive, fine, we can do something.
But
however,
what can you give me?
Only if you do this.
Yeah.
Introduce me to 3 people. Write an internal referral. Write an internal case study. Or I'll write it, you just sign it off. And it's a way of building value into something. Like, what's going within your discount threshold if you can get a referral to 3 peers that are in decision-making positions that you could get business from? Nothing. But it's nothing to them either. It's virtuous in the value it creates. So I'd say I've just gone off on a bit of a tangent, but
no, it's really good. No, I guess what there is networking and negotiating with them to get those introductions, and I think that's one really good way of opening up into new territories. And largely, that's what I did early on in my sales career: would be build a good relationship, do a good piece of work, whether they do it out of the kindness of their heart because you built a solid relationship, or as you said, you do it as part of a negotiation to get it. I mean, it's a good tactic. Where I've had other successes as well, which may be probably more geared towards new business development, but you work with once you sign on a client, if you can have them as like a logo or a client that you've worked with, you'd be surprised by how many new opportunities I've had, which are from when a business has contacted me and said, we're one of your quotable clients, how do we work with you? And it's because we've targeted marketing and ad campaigns at that geography. We're targeting this particular sort of persona in this country, and and as part of our campaigns, we leverage these are the people we work with. And you're right, there's not always that connect. So just because I work with the guys in the UK doesn't mean the US know that. So you'd be surprised by the amount of opportunities where they've gone, I've just had your email through. I'm obviously part of your email marketing campaign, but I'm our business is already one of your global clients. Like, tell us a bit more about that. And it's more of an organic way. It's still sort of colder outreach. You're still doing new business development without having that warm, fuzzy introduction, but you can sometimes leverage that to your advantage. And obviously, again, marketing, I think events. We can't go into, again, that's probably a whole podcast episode, but I think once you can start leveraging those marketing events, expos, whatever it may be, I think they can be really good ways to try and demonstrate what's working in one geography, but then also tailoring it as to why it makes sense for it be the US or Europe or where else.
Agreed. I think obviously marketing is crucial to it, isn't it? Getting your message out and pulling customers into you. But the things you can personally control are essentially doing a good job, and where you can, asking for those referrals. But oftentimes, if you do the right thing and you provide value and the relationship is very strong and you've got a long-term focus that you want the relationship with whoever other team you're dealing with to go on, then those referrals kind of come. Like, I often get contacted by people and it's like, they just reach out to me and it's like, where'd you get my name from? But it's from someone I worked with last year, and we did a good piece of work, and they just did an internal referral without me even knowing about it. And those sort of things can happen if you're doing all the right things, as good salespeople know.
Well, as we all know, I mean, lots of these markets are quite, probably a bad word, but they're quite incestuous in terms of, if you work in financial services, the chances are, if you're working in one big bank and you're going to move to another company or another job, it's likely going to be at another big bank. So that relationship, that personal relationship you built with them is going to follow you there. Equally, they all go to the same sort of events. They all operate in the same circles. So, we always like to think we're dealing with these people, and we can sometimes be surprised when we get it there. But if someone's turning around and, for you, it's obviously risk mitigation. For me, it's, business development. If they've got a need and they've had a good experience, people talk. It's a much smaller world and circle than we all think. So it's you're right, and that's why you can only burn a customer once. So I think it's that positive experience is always the main thing. Prioritize that, even if that means telling someone, this is what I do. but it's probably not a good fit for what you're doing now. But, great, thanks for your time. That person might move off to another company, another geography, and then they come back and go, well, actually, it wasn't a good fit for me at that company, but now I'm at company B. I think it'd be great. And your data is really good for that, or it really works really well. And then you have that relationship. So I think personal relationships, and almost like for you, that's your own brand. They know, deal with Tom. He's good. He knows what he's talking about. This is what they've done. This is why it works. I think that can go a long way when trying to open up different opportunities in different geographies. Okay.
Obviously, salespeople, you've got to. Oh, sorry, Alice. That's one more thing to say
okay.
on that. As a salesperson, obviously, you've got to hit your quota. Of course you do. And most people have monthly quotas or quarterly quotas. You have to do what you need to do to get your quota. I get it. But you should always have a long-term view with your customer, because you never know when that's going to come back around and the value that it'll bring you further down the road. I got contacted a couple of weeks ago by a customer I dealt with 9 years ago.
Wow.
And not spoke to him for 9 years. And they messaged me. I was like, what the heck? All right. You must have either a fuzzy memory or some positive recollection of the way we worked together. But that goes to show that, I had that long-term view and the value was there. And then 9 years later, they came back to me and said, can we have a chat about something? And anyway, just a random
it works the same the other way, Well, but I mean, that person was probably surprised you're still at the same company, because again, that's more of a rarity nowadays. So, I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, it's people you work with, and maybe that links nice into my next point anyway. But it's people we work with, from internally, whether it be elsewhere. We all move around. People work in different companies and businesses, so your own personal brand and that relationship can carry you quite far over. The last sort of point on this, really, I was hoping to cover off you then as well, is I think it's one that's important, probably more so for me as well, is what I call using your own international resource. So it's all well and good. I work in the UK, but I work and manage a US team, and that's great, and I can try my best to learn those things, but use the people around you. I'm sure when you've moved out to the US, I'm sure you've leveraged your US colleagues who can tell you more about, no, Tom, this is, etiquette wise, this is what you should do. This is how you position it. And I think that's sometimes underrated. We all like to think we're the best at what we do. But I think the minute you stop learning or try to take on from others, I think you can miss something there. So I think the last point I was really going to ask you in terms of, how do you sometimes manage that, international resource? And it's a bit of a harder question because you are US based now, but when you were UK based and you were targeting these different geographies where you had a presence there, how did you leverage that?
Yeah. Well, I didn't do a very good job, to be honest, when I was living in the UK, because I thought I knew it and I didn't. Yeah. So I was ignorant. So that's something I admit. When I moved to America and you start to realize, oh shoot, I didn't actually know everything. And I still don't, and I never will. And you get to that realization. You just got to ask people and have conversations and have productive discussion. And if you don't know something, ask someone who you think is going to know. It's all about your personal network and your relationships. I think that's the key thing. And you said it. Don't think you know everything, because you don't. You never will. And if you think you know everything, it's a bad road to be on. So that's kind of the mentality you should have. I'm always trying to learn something. I'm always trying to grow. And there's people that know more about stuff than I do. Well, learn from them. And if you've got a network of people either in your own business or that you've worked with or that are in your friend group that understand or have worked in different countries, ask the questions, have conversations, and you'll learn from it.
That's why I called you up when I started moving and targeting the US market, mate. So don't you worry, I'm practicing that advice. But the last thing I'm going to ask you, but just to close off this episode, it's a little bit cheesy, but we do it on most of the ones. What's the advice you'd give to your younger self? If you could give one piece of advice that you think, if I'd learned that, it would have helped me out so much. What is it?
I don't really know. I'll try and give you a decent answer.
Yeah.
I think that I've been in sales now for 12, 13 years, and I've had some success. I've messed a few things up. I've had periods where it's been difficult for me, but mostly it's been very positive. So if I got the chance to run it back again, I'd probably do it. I would take it. But one thing that I'd say is, to the point we just talked about, you don't know everything. You never will. And selling is such a massive topic. There's so much to it that you can it's never ending. Like international selling, psychology of selling, time motivating yourself, productivity management, just general. There's so much to it, and I've gone through periods of my life where I've just done my job, worked hard. That's been about it. And I've gone through periods of my life where I've been working hard, doing my job, but also doing stuff outside of my job. So like learning things, reading things, studying, doing seminars, listening to educational podcasts, like trying to better myself. And if I could go back, I would say do more of that when you were younger. Take it more seriously.
Eternally the student. And I was hoping you was going to keep running then, because you were just rattling off future podcast episodes for me, psychology of selling and all this. So no, it's really good advice. It's definitely advice that I'm still even trying to take on now. 8 years into my sales career. But we're coming up to time, so we'll wrap it up there. But Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. We could have carried on and on and on, so I'm sure we'll have some future episodes where we bring you back on as a guest, because it's been really insightful. But been a pleasure, and we'll catch you on the next episode.